What's going on, guys? Rime teacher in the house, and I am here with the much anticipated GPL post-draft power rankings. Now, normally I would be doing this, of course, with my good friend Denisio, of course, who's the commissioner of the league, but unfortunately, Denny's not able to make it. He's been having issues with his internet, so it's just going to be me this week, which is kind of awkward, because this is the first one, and it's also the most subjective one. This is always a tricky one to do, post-draft power rankings. Normally my power ranking videos are done with win-loss and differential, but we haven't played any games yet. So unfortunately you're going to have to bear with me. This is going to be my opinion, and it is purely my opinion based on the strength of the draft. Now that can be very subjective to a lot of people. When I look at strengths of draft, I like to think of, have you completed your common cores? We look at Fire, Water, Grass, and Fairy, Dragon, Steel cores as kind of important in Draft League. There's a lot of them around. There's a lot of good cores out there in the game. So if you're missing cores, that could definitely cause an issue. Also, looking at team synergy. Does your team work well together? Are you working with Pokemon that can actually work together, or is your team very disjointed? Are there lots of duplicate typings? Are you weak to very common things like that? Things like entry houses. Do you have hazard setters? Do you have good removal? These things can really play into what can be a strength of a draft. There is a small hint of perhaps player bias. Obviously I know a lot of these players, so I do know their skill levels and various things like that. So it can be tricky to judge. There might be a little bit of bias here, but again, this is of course my opinion, and feel free to let me know if you think I'm wrong. But yeah, we're all human, we all have our different opinions. So let's get right into number 16. Right down the bottom of the power rankings. You hate to see it, but it's going to be Expert Cool, coach of the Flaming Skull. This team breaks a lot of drafting 101. There's no Fire, Water, Grass core here at all. In fact, there's literally no Fire type, and there is actually no Grass type either, which is a massive problem. Looking at this team, there's also no Dragon type. Which is an issue. We do see the Mimikyu, of course, for the Fairy typing, and the Doublade for Steel typing, which isn't bad. But the Triple Electric type and the Pikachu Gmax is really not that good. Gmax Pikachu, even with a Violet, actually doesn't really live hits very well. This team is probably the only team I'm projecting to go 0-8 across the season. I don't see Cool winning a game. That being said, though, there are some cool little pockets of interesting pairs. Look, we do see the Pincurchin Hawlucha there, which is very much a budget Coco Lucha from Gen 7. Pincurchin does get hazards though, it does get spikes and toxic spikes, which isn't bad. Removal wise, there's not that much here either. Hawlucha gets defog, but you're not really going to want to run it on that. And then pretty much Rotom-Fan is your next hazard removal, and Rotom-Fan's not really that great a Pokemon in general. There is things like speed passing with Ninjask, of course. Umbreon is a decent stall Pokemon, but not super great in this team. There are small Trick Room elements to this team. Mimikyu gets Trick Room, and Wishy-Washy is actually very well known as a Trick Room sweeper, but it's just like little pockets of good pairs and not really a team in general. So I think this team is really going to struggle this season. You hate to see it, but Cool is drafting for the first time, so it's not too much of a surprise to see it, but you just hate to see it. Well, hopefully Cool proves me wrong. Coming in at number 15 is the Exo-Sniped Excadrills. This one was a hard one for me because obviously I know Exo really well. Exo and I have great matches over the years, but his draft really could not have gone much worse for him in a lot of ways. First picking Jirachi on first pick is a very unusual thing. That's not something you see very often. Jirachi did get some nice buffs this gen, but I don't think it's first pick of a draft worthy. There were definitely some power picks in that S tier that he missed. But yeah. Aside from that, like, the Gmax Snorlax is a great Pokemon, but it really thrives in a team that isn't this one. This team doesn't really suit the Gmax Snorlax that well, in my opinion. Yes, it's a great physical attacker with decent HP and special defense, but its Gmax move Replenish is only really good if you're running a berry, and even if you are running a berry, it's 50% chance to get it back. It's not great odds, honestly. But yeah, he does have some shining lights here. The Mamoswine is great. Ribombee, of course, is my favourite Pokemon. How can I hate on a draft that has my mascot in it? But this draft is missing a grass type, it is missing a dragon type, and that is a big problem. Dragon is a very powerful typing, and yes, Silvally can potentially patch one of those types missing up, but you may want to be running Silvally Ghost. There's no Ghost type on this team either. Silvally Ghost is a very popular Silvally form, alongside Silvally Normal itself. So it's kind of tough. I don't necessarily think his draft is super great. One thing I do notice here is there is an error on this, as Lantern has actually been traded for Mantine, so that's something to bear in mind. I actually started recording this before a lot of changes went down, so yeah, that is a trade that's happened. Mantine is an okay addition to the team, much needed special bulk and also a ground immunity. This team did struggle with ground type moves with Jirachi, Morpeko, Lantern and Salazzle all being heavily weak to it, so that's something to bear in mind. I do know one thing with Exo though, is he is fantastic at using lower tier Pokemon. He plays a lot of low tier ladder on Showdown. He is a very talented player with these lower tier Pokemon, but I don't see how this team synergizes. Like, yes, Xatu is a magic bouncer and has entry hazards, which is cool, does also get defog on its own. Does get Trick Room, which helps the Snorlax, but it doesn't really help the rest of the team that well. He's got quite a lot of fast Pokemon in the Salazzle, the Sock, Ribombee, of course. And, you know, Jirachi's a base 100, it's not a bad speed tier at all. So, yeah, it's kind of a weird situation for me. It's a weird team. I don't think the balance is quite there. So I'm not really that confident in Exo's draft. I do know he got sniped to oblivion. I know I sniped him a couple of times and things like that. So it is always hard when you're in that position. But again, Exo is definitely a better player than 15th in the league. Mechanically, he's a much better player. His draft just fell apart for me. Alright, coming in at number 14 is going to be Burger. Now, this one was a tough one for me to place, because I actually like quite a few portions of this draft. But the issue is Burger came in late, and he really had to pick up the scraps. Which is always hard to do in a draft. It's never easy to do that. But I did take the time to watch his draft breakdown. I think actually considering that he picked up the scraps after the rest of us drafted our teams, you know, the Corviknight, the Haxorus, and the Slurpuff are all very solid Pokemon. Boltund is a Pokemon I've grown quite a lot of love for recently. I've used it in a couple of drafts. It's actually very nice. Really good Pokemon. Gmax Sandaconda was originally on my team, but I'll talk about that when we get to my team, because I did actually make some changes while we're here. But yeah. I do think the top half of his draft is not bad, but as it starts to go down, I'm not a fan of the Vileplume. Personally, I don't think it's the best. There's no fire type in this team, which is kind of unfortunate. But he does have a really solid Fairy Dragon Steel Core. And his team is relatively quick. Obviously, the Accelgor really helps with that, being the fastest model in his team. Haxorus with Dragon Dance can be very strong. Boltund is naturally relatively quick. He's got an okay balance of decent amount of bulk with good amount of offense. I do think he's going to be heavily relying on that Haxorus, though, which is something that Solo Destroyer did a fantastic job with last season. But it's a very different metagame this season, and I'm not sure he's going to be that effective this time round. I do think there's some good pieces to this team. I think there is a good potential for this to be higher up the power rankings, but it is just so difficult to place right now. Alright, coming in at number 13 is going to be Cap Guy Nagoshi. I actually don't have an issue with the Team Body Press team per se. It's got quite a few decent components. Obviously, you do firstly see the Cantonian starter trio, which is kind of funny to see. The double water type is kind of interesting with Red on Wash and Blastoise. But the theme of this was Body Press. That was what they were going for. They grabbed as many Pokemon with Body Press as they could, which is kind of fun. It's definitely got some scope to it. And it's missing a Fairy type, which is kind of an interesting situation. I haven't seen many non-Fairy drafts in a while. But yeah, I do think that can be a bit of a blow. Fairy is obviously a good Dragon answer, being an immunity and doing a lot of damage. I do think this is kind of more of a meme-style team. That being said, though, Gmax Zard is not bad. Kommo-o is a very solid hit Pokemon in general, especially with that Clangorous Soul. Rotom-Frost is a great pivot. Venusaur and Blastoise, relatively bulky. Blastoise with Shell Smash this gen is definitely interesting. It's not its Mega, though, so it doesn't have Mega Launcher, so it doesn't hit that hard. but it is a decent spinner. Steelix is actually a very solid mon with body press and iron defense. Claydol I don't know much about in this gen, to be honest. Pyukumuku is the annoying stall mon. And obviously Cinccino, relatively decent normal stab, and Gothorita, budget Gothitelle for Shadow Tag and Trick Room. It's not bad, but it's not great. But yeah, I think this team has potential to be okay. It just depends on the players using it and how effective they can actually be at making this team work. Alright, coming in at number 12 is going to be Happy Nico and the Cataclysmic Conkeldurrs. This was probably one of the hardest teams for me to think about, especially as you see Gmax, Gengar, Conkeldurr, and Obstagoon, which have been running around the OU ladder quite a lot. Obviously Gmax, Gengar is banned, but Conkeldurr, Obstagoon have definitely been big threats this generation, especially with the slight limitations of fairy typing. There's not many offensive fairies out there at the moment. But my concern with this, really, is that a lot of his cores are sitting down in the lower tiers. One thing that's worth noting is the Barbaracle was actually traded out for Mantine, which was then traded out for Lantern, so the Barbaracle should be Lantern on this draft. I will have that fixed for next time we do this. But yeah, usually when you want your cores, I mean, Charizard is a great Pokemon, it's a good heavy duty boots user. Appletun has got thick padded cores, which mitigates that quad ice weakness slightly. Bronzong is a very nice Steelmon, actually a good Trick Room setter. But Togetic kind of worries me slightly. Togetic's a great bulky fairy, but it can't do anywhere near the good amount of stuff that Togekiss can do. So that kind of scares me a little bit. I think he's very much a top-heavy draft. I think he's relying on the Gengar, the Conkeldurr, and the Obstagoon to put in as much work as possible. I do worry about the rest of his team being more bulk than anything else. That's something that does concern me slightly. But I think Nico is a very solid player. I do remember Nico from other places. He definitely has decent battle sense, so I'll be interested to see how he pilots his team and if he can get this team to work. I'm a little worried about the overdone of bulk and the over-reliance on one or two particular Pokemon. That's my concern. Alright. Coming in at number 11 is going to be Crimpix. It's nice to actually have Crimpix not ranked at the bottom of a leaderboard for once. A lot of this comes off the back, much like Nico in a way, these two are kind of interchangeable position-wise. They're very top-heavy teams. Like Gmax Duraludon is actually very powerful, does get some decent coverage moves that can abuse that max. Darmanitan, of course, a lot of us are very familiar with that thing. It's a fantastic wall breaker, does a huge amount of damage. Clefable finally got unaware back thanks to Pokemon Home. So Clefable's got a lot of bulk. Gastrodon is a very nice bulky Pokemon. Rotom is a decent pivot. But then, as you start moving further down the draft roster, you kind of sense a few little problems. Braviary, decent offensive mon, but without Dynamax, it's actually not as good. Its hazard removal does get Tailwind, so it can be relatively okay. But it's not that great without the Dynamax, in my opinion. Froslass, pure utility mon, does get Spikes and Destiny Bond, which is nice, does also get Taunt, but it's very frail and very easy to kill. Shuckle, of course, incredibly bulky, good hazard setter, but doesn't really do much other than that, so that is a kind of a concern for me. And Meowstic, Liepard, both Prankster users. Meowstic known for Prankster Screens, Liepard known for Prankster T-Wave and Taunt. Decent utility, but not really a lot of offensive pressure. So it kind of worries me that his big offensive carries are pretty much Duraludon, Darmanitan, and potentially Braviary, potentially Carmine Clef, but like there's very few kind of carries and clear win conditions on this team. Alongside that, Crimpix did have considerable amount of help from DJ drafting. I always get worried when someone else drafts my team because it's very difficult to pilot a team that you didn't actually pick. But I do know Crimpix did have some input in picking these mons. So I do hope Crimpix does get a win this season. I do think he will get at least one. But it's going to be very tricky. There's quite a few very strong teams in the conference, so we'll see what happens. Coming in at number 10 is going to be Nitro and the Buffalo Belligerent Bufalons. This team's kind of interesting to me and kind of not at the same time. This team's got a lot to offer in terms of bulk. Ferrothorn, very bulky steel type. Very solid mon in general, has always been there or thereabouts in the top tiers. Galarian Corsola, of course, we all know how annoying that thing is unless you can actually wear it down. Araquanid, decent bulky offense. Aromatisse, of course, bulky Wish user. And then DeRozan, of course, bulky Reuniclus in so many ways because it can take advantage of that Violite. I worry a little bit offensively about this team. This team does have decent Trick Room potential. I'm not sure if Corsola ever got Trick Room, but I know Aromatisse gets it, and I know Duosion gets it. So there's quite a lot of cool options there, but I worry a little bit about these speed tiers. This team is somewhat very slow. It relies on Flapple getting Dragon Dances. Alolan Raichu is pretty quick. It's the fastest base speed on the team, which is decent. I do worry about the amount of offense he's going to take, because he's likely to take a lot of hits before he dishes out damage. The Gmax Centiskorch is an interesting pick. It's not a pick I'm too familiar with, if I'm honest, but being quad weak to rocks is definitely an issue. But yeah, I think this team has got decent bulk. This team is also distinctly lacking hazard removal. There's literally no removal on this team whatsoever. That is definitely a problem. Hazard stack is definitely a thing, and Corsola really doesn't want entry hazards and anything like that. Especially with things like Araquanid being weak to rocks, Centiskorch being heavily weak to rocks. There's definitely a few problems with this team, but I think Nitro has a good chance to be able to patch that up in the coming weeks. There's definitely options that are still out there, you know, excuse me, but yeah, I think Nitro's got an interesting season. He's got a tough group, but I do think his team is not that bad. Coming in at number 9 is going to be Tyler Poke, trainer, coach of the Munchin Munchlax. This team kind of all-ins on Trick Room, which is kind of scary. All-inning on a very complex strategy. We saw this with Crimpix last season, that if you're not particularly good with Trick Room, it can really bite you in the backside, as it did Crimpix pretty much every game last season, unfortunately for him. But nonetheless, this is one of the few teams that actually has very solid cores. Obviously, the Fire, Water, Grass core is the Appletun, the Shandy, and the Quagsire. Relatively bulky, except Chandelure, of course, more offensive, of course. And then the Fairy Dragon Steel core of Appletun, Sylveon, and Galarian Stunfisk seems to be a little bit weaker. Galarian Stunfisk not really that high on a lot of people's priority list. Mimicry is a kind of interesting ability, but I think that ability needs to be on a better Pokemon. I'm not a huge fan of the Hitmontop pick as well. I've said this quite a few times to many people over the years. I think Hitmontop is not a great singles Pokemon. Yes, it gets Rapid Spin, and yes, it does get a lot of priority, but it doesn't hit that hard. Even through the Intimidate, it's not that strong. Intimidate, of course, got nerfed in this gen, so it's not actually as good as it is before. Gothitelle is a good Trick Room one. Trick Room wise, there's not that many Trick Room setters on this team outside of Dottler and Gothitelle from what I'm seeing. And his fastest Pokemon is Rotom-Frost, which is kind of scary. This can easily be punished by a lot of faster teams. There's quite a few fast teams in this draft, so I'm a little worried for Tyler. I think his team's very one-dimensional. His team's got a lot of special offense and not a lot of physical offense. He's only really relying on Snorlax, Galarian Stunfisk, and Hitmontop. Hitmontop not the greatest offensive. Galarian Stunfisk more known for its bulk. Snorlax definitely can hit like a truck if it's allowed to set up, but the question is he's got to be setting up on it. And there's a lot of fighting coverage out there right now, so who knows. Well, I think this team is one-dimensional, but it is relatively well-rounded. It's one of the few drafts that's got completed cores. Some of them are missing cores, which doesn't help. But yeah, I think this is a very interesting team. I'm interested to see how Tyler plays it. He actually faces me week 1. We play later this week, so that's going to be interesting to see how he handles it. Alright. Number 8 is going to be Sylvie and the Miami Sylveons. It's actually nice to see Sylvie up here. Sylvie's often been a little bit there or thereabouts in the lower end of the table. I actually think his draft is very solid. I think there's some really interesting Pokemon here. Mew, of course, is a Pokemon he's brought before. Togekiss is a Pokemon he knows very well. Lucario is a nice Pokemon. I like its offensive pressure. It's very versatile. Inteleon's a cool starter pick for me. The fact it gets both screens and is pretty fast is interesting. His cores are actually not really that bad at all. Flapple, being a dragon type, Togekiss being fairy, and Lucario being steel. Pretty offensive, of course, very powerful in all 3 of those categories. But It's paired up very nicely with a good web setter in Galvantula. I think Galvantula is one of the better web setters in the game. Orbeetle is definitely a good competition for it, though. Rabombi is the fastest web setter in the game, of course. This draft is very, very potent. I think Mew is that standout for me. Mew, Togekiss, Flapple is a pretty aggressive combination up the top there. Get that supported with Sticky Webs from Galvantula. Can really punch holes in these teams. I'm just interested to see how Sylvie pilots it. I think that's going to be the big deal here, is can Sylvie make this team work? We have seen Sylvie in the past have good matchups and then kind of not make it happen. But then we've seen Sylvie go from the Sublime to the Ridiculous and the Ridiculous to the Sublime and pull out wins that you never thought were coming. So you never quite know what you're going to get with Sylvie, and that's going to be interesting for me to see where he goes this season. Coming in at number 7 is probably one that I think a lot of people are going to find controversial. I've actually put Transil, the current champion, and the Hectic Hydreigons down here. Now, I recently watched Professor's stream when he talked about his team and other teams. Now, he actually thinks this is the strongest draft in the league. I beg to differ. Yes, it's very easy to tunnel in on the Hatterene, Gmax, the Aegislash, and the Cinderace, and you can potentially throw Noivern in that mix. These are really decent offensive Pokemon that are very well known in the Draft League format. Aegislash finally getting nerfed to the point where it's actually draftable. Very solid Steel-type Pokemon. Gmax, Hatterene, of course. Hatterene is a phenomenal Trick Room abuser, but this team doesn't lend itself to Trick Room that well. Alongside that, you know, you're looking at the Cinderace and the Noivern, which are blisteringly fast Pokemon. They don't work in Trick Room. As simple as that, unless you're planning on running Lagging Tail for some bizarre reason. But yeah, I do think his offensive pressure is good, but I think where this team kind of struggles for me is how passive his defensive core is. Like Vaporeon, Piloswine, Raichu, not really known for their good offensive pressure. They don't really gain you momentum very easily. I mean, Raichu does get Volt Switch, of course, but in terms of the actual momentum, these Pokemon really slow your pressure down, and Transil is not really known for his patient playstyle. He's a lot more aggressive as a player. He tends to push advantages and just keep pushing these advantages, and I don't see an easy way for him to do that with this team. Yes, Cinderace does get Core Change, of course, but Core Change is not as good as you might think because it just swaps entry hazards over. So if the hazards are on both sides of the field, it really doesn't really make much of a difference. So that's something to watch out for. I do think Transil, though, is mechanically one of the strongest players in the league. If this was a player ranking league instead of a draft ranking, Transil, of course, is in the top 3 minimum. The guy's a very strong player. If he can make this team work, more power to him. I think his team is too passive, though. I think some changes would be nice. There is no grass type currently on this team. I'd like to see something like Serena. I think Serena with a decent Rapid Spinner is actually very solid for this team. It hits pretty hard as well. Gives them a little bit more pressure rather than just pure passive. So yeah, that's my worry with Transil. I do think he's got some strong top end, but his bottom side is not quite as good. Alright. Number 6 is actually going to be me. I did make some changes here, so I will point this out. There's one change on here that hasn't updated for some reason, but I don't have Gmax Sandaconda anymore. I actually have Gmax Orbeetle instead, thanks to Burger joining the draft. He actually traded with me. He needed a ground type, and I was quite happy to give my Gmax away because I wanted Orbeetle anyway. So I got my Gmax Orbeetle up in the top there, which actually gives me a web setter. Shoutouts to Exo for pointing out that Accelgor doesn't actually get webs. I thought it did, but it doesn't. And also down the bottom there, I traded my Malamar over to Nitro for Rhydon, and I picked up Skuntank for Accelgor because I needed a grounded poison type because I actually didn't have one in my draft, and it also keeps my dark type open, which is always nice to have. So this draft really is quite versatile and also really hard-hitting. I've got a lot of the checkboxes completed with the cores. I've got a fairly solid Fairy Dragon Steel core in that Cobalion, Whimsicott, and Goodra. And I got my Fire Water Grass core completed by Whimsicott, Jellicent, and Rapidash. Now, a lot of people don't think much of Rapidash. me too, to be fair. But yeah, it's very fast, it's got a decent attack stat, and it gets Sword Stance and Morning Sun. It's kind of budget Arcanine in a way. Doesn't get Intimidate, but does get Flame Body instead, so not too bad. It does also get Flash Fire, so it can be a fire immunity, which isn't always an interesting little trick to put in there. Rhydon gives me a decent ground type still. It's a good rock setter with a Violite. Skuntank gives me Defog. Something that's worth noting is all 3 of my Defoggers are actually not weak to rocks, thanks to Sigilyph having Magic Guard and Whimsicott being a grass and fairy type. I got solid offense with that Zeraora, of course. Zeraora stands out very strong in this draft. Paired up with Cobalion, they're both very solid pivots. Which definitely helps. I have a lot of pivoting options. Orbeetle gets U-turn, Zeraora and Cobalion get Volt Switch. Whimsicott gets U-turn. Skuntank, of course, gets Memento. These are all things that are worth noting. Obviously, he solid, jealous, and bulky water. Sniped that from Exo as a water absorb mon to help deal with Dracovish, which is actually in my conference. So it's good prep to have. But yeah, I think my draft is generally solid. My biggest alarm for me is my ground weakness. I do have 5 Pokemon weak to ground on my team. But I do have Sigilyph, which is an immunity, and Whimsicott and Orbeetle are both resists. And to be fair, Jellicent and Goodra really do take hits relatively well. So my bulkier cores, even with my weaknesses, is relatively patchable. So I think this draft is decent. I don't think it's particularly strong, but considering we only have 10 picks in a draft, I think I actually played this draft as well as I could have done with the cards I was given. So yeah, I'm interested to see how this goes for me, of course. Hopefully this team goes well. We'll see. I am potentially looking at free agent trades. I've got a couple of Pokemon in mind that I'm kind of interested in that I would like to try out, but we'll see if I can actually fit them on this team. Alright, so at this point I start having a bit of a nightmare because the top 5 is incredibly difficult. I think a lot of these drafts are really, really strong drafts, and I've constantly moved these around all the time since I started. So, coming in at number 5 is going to be Shadow AX and the Shiroi Shadows. He was a little bit higher up, but I do think there's a bit of an issue with this squad, and I think that can potentially hold it back. Now, much like a lot of these stronger teams, these cores are actually very nice with Keldeo, Incineroar, Blossom. Blossom, not the best grass type in the world, does get Quiver Dance, however. But it's definitely an interesting Pokemon, of course. And the Fairy Dragon Steel Core is actually completed with just Grimmsnarl and Duraludon, which is pretty interesting. Gmax Grimmsnarl is often considered one of the best Gmaxes in the game. I beg to differ. I'm not 100% sure how good it is in the singles format. His Gmax move actually is very strong in VGC. It has the ability to put 2 Pokemon in yawn state, so it goes to sleep the following turn. It's a very powerful mon as well offensively. It does get a lot of offensive moves. Keldeo is nice to see it back. Does get Calm Mind, a very decent offensive mon. Duraludon also very offensive. Incineroar can be bulky and offensive. But the thing that worries me about this team is the triple fighting type. Fighting has quite a few problems with weaknesses, being weak to Fairy, Psychic, and Flying. Flying not the most prevalent, but Psychic and Fairy are certainly prevalent. And yes, you can argue Grimmsnarl and Incineroar are immune to Psychic types, but things like the Psychic types can get fighting moves like Focus Blast and Moonblast for Fairy coverage, especially looking at Gardevoir as an example. So this is not always that patchable. There is a little bit of a ground weakness trying to creep in there, but there is Vikavolt, of course. Dusclops seems to be a staple in a lot of Shadows GPL drafts. Dusclops is a really nice, fat, bulky Pokemon. Does get Trick Room, which can be interesting for things like offensive Mudsdale, can be good for Incineroar as well. So definitely look forward to seeing that. Definitely Trick Room Vikavolt is a thing. Obviously we don't often see it because most Vikavolts run agility, but yeah, I think this is very potent. This definitely has a solid amount of bases to work from, but I do think Shadow might want to rebalance these triple fighting types. I don't really see what value Persimmon adds to this team. I don't think Persimmon is that strong of a fighting type in general. It's often YS and C tier. It's a good Scarfmon, but that's about as far as it goes for me. But yeah, Shadow mechanically is a very tough player. He's my kryptonite. He always beats me every time I play him, and I don't know how he does it. I think he just gets inside my head. So I'm quite happy he's in the other conference and I don't have to face it, to be honest, unless I get to playoffs and have to then. But yeah, either way, it's a tough team. Really good team offensively and some decent defensive Pokemon. I just think there's a couple of Pokemon that need a little bit of adjusting. Alright. Coming in at number 4 is always my biggest nightmare to place is weather teams. Now, a lot of people know weather is very hit and miss in draft. If you're good with weather, it's very strong, and if you're not good with weather, it's kind of bad. This team is high up, actually, for me, because obviously it's got a great weather core in the Torkoal, the Heliolisk, and the Shiftry, all really good sun users. But this team actually functions perfectly well without the weather as well. Gmax, Copperajah, Dragapult, Seismitoad, very, very potent mons in their own right. Seismitoad can be very good offensively and defensively. Gmax, Copperajah, the Steel move, I think it's actually worse than Steel Spike, but Steel-type Rocks is kind of an interesting little dynamic that could definitely play in the minds of some players. But yeah, Cloyster's an interesting Pokemon, always Shell Smash shenanigans, definitely kind of threatening. Torkoal, of course, gets Shell Smash as well. Weezing's got some interesting abilities, getting Neutralizing Gas this gen is kind of an interesting one for it. It does make it a grounded poison type, as I found out, thanks to DJ for pointing that one out to me. I'm used to it being a Levitator, so I'm not used to seeing it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting Pokemon here. The one Pokemon that kind of confuses me about this team is the Eldegoss pick. I don't really see what value Eldegoss actually adds to this team. I'd like to see that pick adjusted slightly. Maybe pick up a different type of mon. I'm not seeing a fairy type on this team, so I don't know what fairy types are sitting down in low tier. But I'd like to see one of those. That will complete his cores much better than Eldegoss can do. Eldegoss doesn't really offer that much, in my opinion. It's got okay speed control with a Cotton Down ability. Does get Leech Seed and things like that, but I don't see him ever picking Eldegoss for a game. So I'm not sure. But I do love Dragapult. Dragapult's one of my favorite new Pokemon. I love the Sun Core, and I love the fact that it's DJ piloting it. DJ is a very talented weather user, so he's definitely up there in terms of the draft strength for me. I'm interested to see how he makes this team work. Alright. Coming in at number 3 is going to be Solo Destroyer. This is very close to being the best draft, in my opinion. Something that is worth noting with this is he actually has dropped Stonjourner for Glaceon, which is kind of a downgrade, in my opinion. Obviously, when you see Dracovish teams with these appropriate speed control around it, Corviknight gets Tailwind, as does Drampa, funnily enough. Gardevoir and Orbeetle are Trickery Muse, as Orbeetle also gets Webs, which is pretty solid. Pangoro is a phenomenal wall breaker. Double is actually very good with Cotton Guard Body Press. Haunt is a little bit of an oddball pick, but it doesn't surprise me to see it. But yeah. Dracovish teams are always very potent, and they are always very scary. There is no grass type on this team, which is a little unfortunate, not quite the core. The other thing that is kind of a problem with this is there's actually no Stealth Rocks. Literally no Rock Setters at all on this team. Stonjourner was his Rock Setter, but he's traded it away, took it off. I do think maybe try and build some entry hazards in here. There are some Rock Setters still out there, even in C tier, so hopefully he picks one up somewhere. I don't understand the Glaceon pick, I have to be honest. There is potential good Trickery Muse. Obviously, Drampa is a phenomenal Trickery Pokemon. Decent pivoting options, thanks to Rotom Heat, of course. Good hazard removal in the Defoggers, especially from Corviknight. So I do think there's some interesting power in this team. Definitely Solo is able to make Dracovish work. This team has got all the tools to work with it. Got a very solid secondary carry in that Pangoro. Gardevoir, if it's running Specs or Scarf, can also be a very solid carry. Gmax Corviknight, pretty bulky. I definitely think regular Dynamax Corviknight's moves are actually better. I don't think Gmax for the Corviknight is actually that great. But it's really bulky and really hard to break at the best of times. So yeah, I think Solo's got a very powerful team, and it does suit his aggressive playstyle as well, especially Dracovish. Dracovish is a monster. He did previously carry on Haxorus, so I'll be interested to see if he can do similar stuff with Dracovish. Alright, coming in at number 2 is going to be Professor Chaos and the Garden State Blizzards. I love this draft for a lot of reasons, but I also hate this draft for a lot of reasons. I hate this draft because I would hate to have to play against it. Lapras Gmax Resonance, it basically sets up a Aurora Veil, which is really, really obnoxious. Hydreigon got massively buffed this patch thanks to Nasty Plot. Does get Roost and, of course, U-Turn for pivoting. Copperajah is a mod I love. I've actually won some casual draft leagues with it when I haven't been recording. Copperajah is a phenomenal Pokemon. I think it's way higher rated than a lot of people think it is. A lot of people just assume it's a Trick Room on because it's a low base speed. This thing doesn't need Trick Room to be powerful. It's strong with it, but it doesn't need to be powerful. Now, he is missing his Fire Water Grass Core, unfortunately. Does have a somewhat weak Fire Interdinator. I'm not a huge fan of the Pokemon in general. It's kind of average at best. Lapras, of course, phenomenal water type with Gmax. The things that I don't particularly agree with about this team, I don't see what Sneasel's adding to this team. If you really wanted a dark type, you've already got Hydreigon. You don't need a secondary dark type, in my opinion. Yes, Sneasel gets knockoff and Ice Shard, which is nice. Priority is always helpful, especially if it's Stab. But I feel like the Sneasel pick just wasn't worth it, in my opinion. Something that is worth noting is Professor has actually opted to trade away Sneasel for Manectric via free agency, but he won't have that until week 2. Manetric's a significant upgrade to this team. It does kind of give him a bit further of a ground weakness, which can be an issue, but gives him a faster Pokemon that can pivot around. His only previous pivot was Hydreigon with U-Turn. But nonetheless, there is solid Trick Room possibilities here. Cofagrigus gets Trick Room, of course, which can set up Rhyperior. Rhyperior phenomenal in Trick Room, as is Copperajah. Hitmonchan is an interesting pickup. I like Hitmonchan a lot. Rapid Spin Bullet Punch is kind of the bane of my existence as a Rabombi fan, unfortunately. But yeah, Hitmonchan an interesting pick. Ditto is actually kind of a risk, but kind of worth it as well, because outside of things like Hydreigon, which is a middling speed tier, his team's kind of slow and doesn't really counter setup that well. So having Ditto there as kind of a setup deterrent is definitely an interesting dilemma for teams to have to play against. I think this team is very well rounded, and if it can be used correctly, is really, really strong. Balanced teams are always hard to place in draft because they're either amazing or awful. I think Professor's a solid player, though. I do think he's got some decent game sense, so I hope to see balance working out for him. He's definitely got some tough matchups. There are some very good drafts in this league, but I do think he's got a very strong team, and if he can use it correctly, and if he makes the correct decisions, I think this team is going to go very far in the league. Which brings us to our number 1 pick. I have to be honest, when I looked at Denistrio's draft, I could not believe how much power this team has. Gmax Tox is actually incredibly strong, thanks to its access to Punk Rock. It's very, very heavy hitting, of course, even out of the Gmax. The Stun Shock is really an interesting mechanic, being able to paralyze or poison Pokemon. Definitely an unusual one, not something you see very often. Necrozma is the big selling point for me, though. Necrozma only really being weak to Ghost and Dark and Bug is an interesting thing. The Prism Armor kind of makes the weakness not seem that good. Necrozma incredibly versatile, gets set up on the physical and special side, can be really bulky, that gets rocks and knockoff and all sorts of coverage. Primarina and Arcanine, both very powerful wall breakers. Virizion, decent setup sweeper. Rapidash is actually kind of an interesting one. Galarian Rapidash is a mon I don't know that much, but I do think Hank Denny is able to use this really well. He's got very solid cores, the Fire, Water, Grass of Primarina, Arcanine, and Virizion. Very offensive, but definitely very strong. Primarina can be a good Assault Vest user. Virizion can also be good for screens. Klinklang is not my preferred option of choice, if I have to be honest with you. I don't particularly like Klinklang all that much. Something that is worth noting is he's missing a dragon, but in all honesty, I don't think that matters in this draft. Like, usually it's bad because it means you're losing a lot of resistances, but this thing just breaks through so much power. It's got really solid pivot with Parting Shot on the Alolan Persian, of course. Arcanine, funnily enough, gets Teleport this generation. I don't really see Denny ever using that, of course. Oh, Type Null, of course, getting U-Turn. Drifblim, actually kind of an interesting Pokemon with Unburden. I could definitely see Drifblim causing a few feathers to be ruffled. But I think this draft is immensely powerful. Like, he could probably just bring the same 6 of these ones every week, and people will still have a hard time against it. I actually had the opportunity to do some practice matches with this team, with Cool, who is his first opponent, and I'm not gonna lie, like, I felt like I had so many tools at my disposal that it was actually disgusting. I could legitimately bring any one of these 10 picks to any game, and it could be really, really potent. I do think this draft won the draft. I definitely think a lot of people might disagree with me, though, but that's just my opinion, of course. This is, of course, the most subjective power ranking video of all of them. Next week, of course, we'll have a round of games so we can actually have a look at these games and we can see what happens. But either way, that's going to be the week 1 power rankings. I hope you guys enjoyed it, of course. Let me know what you think about the rankings down below, or message me privately if you feel more comfortable. But either way, I'm gonna get on out of here. My name is Robombi Teacher. I'm your coach at the Royal Bomber for Bombies. Stay safe, stay awesome, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.